Long before satellites mapped the weather and algorithms forecast the markets, human beings looked for signs. They looked in the cracks of heated bone, in the flight of birds across an empty sky, in the entrails of sacrificed animals laid bare on stone altars, and in the cryptic utterances of women seated on golden tripods above fissures in the earth. They looked because they needed to know. Would the harvest come? Would the battle be won? Would the king survive? The answers, they believed, were already written, hidden in symbols scattered throughout the natural and supernatural world, waiting to be read by those who possessed the knowledge and the courage to seek them. This is the story of those symbols and the people who trusted them. It is a story that stretches across thousands of years and thousands of miles, from the ancient river valleys of China to the sun-bleached slopes of Mount Parnassus in Greece, from the blood-soaked altars of Mesopotamia to the candlelit study of a 16th-century French physician. It is a story of kings who rose and fell because they listened, or refused to listen, to the signs. And it is a story that asks a question humanity has never stopped asking. Can the future be known before it arrives? Sometime around 1250 BCE, in the final centuries of the Shang dynasty, a king named Wu Ding sat in his palace at the capital city of Yin, near what is today the city of Anyang in China's Henan province. Wu Ding ruled over a civilization that had already achieved remarkable sophistication. The Shang people cast magnificent bronzes, developed early forms of mathematics and astronomy, and built complex urban settlements along the Yellow River. But for all their ingenuity, the Shang rulers faced the same uncertainty that has haunted every leader in every age. They did not know what tomorrow would bring, and so they asked. The method they used was as old as the land itself. The royal diviners, men who had trained for years in the sacred art of reading the will of heaven, would take the shoulder blade of an ox or the flat underside of a turtle's shell, scrape it clean and polish it smooth. They would carve rows of small pits and grooves into the surface, each one carefully placed according to ritual specifications. Then, as the king watched and the court held its breath, a diviner would press a heated bronze rod into one of the grooves. The intense heat would cause the bone or shell to crack, sending fine fracture lines spidering outward from the point of contact, and in those cracks the diviner would read the answer. The questions carved into these oracle bones, as they came to be known, covered every conceivable concern of the Shang court. Would it rain in the next 10 days? Should the king lead a military expedition against a neighboring tribe? Was the queen's pregnancy safe? Had an ancestor been properly honored with the correct sacrifice, the diviner would study the pattern of the cracks, interpret their direction and depth, and pronounce a verdict. The king would then make his decision, and a scribe would record the entire proceeding on the bone itself, the date, the name of the diviner, the question that was asked, the interpretation of the cracks, and, remarkably, what actually happened afterward. These records were archived with the same solemnity that modern governments file their most classified documents. And then, for over 3,000 years, they were forgotten. In 1899, a scholar named Wang Yirong lay ill with malaria in the city of Beijing. He was the Chancellor of the Imperial Academy, a man of great learning and refined taste for antiquities. His doctor prescribed a traditional remedy, a powder made from what apothecaries called dragon bones. These fragments of ancient bone had been sold in Chinese medicine shops for centuries, ground into powder and ingested as a cure for various ailments. But when Wang Yirong examined the bones before they were pulverized, he noticed something that no one had seen before, or at least no one had understood. The bones were covered in tiny, deliberate markings. They were not scratches or natural patterns. They were writing, characters, an ancient script that bore a clear resemblance to the inscriptions found on Zhou dynasty bronzes. Wang Yirong realized, with a shock that must have momentarily made him forget his fever, that he was looking at the oldest written records of Chinese civilization. What the pharmacists had been grinding into medicine for generations were the sacred divination archives of the Shang dynasty, the earliest historically verified dynasty in Chinese history. Each bone was a record of a conversation between a king and the spirit world, a transaction between human uncertainty and divine foreknowledge, preserved in a script that scholars can still partially decipher today. Roughly 40% of the characters have been matched to their modern equivalents. Since Wang Yirong's discovery, approximately 150,000 oracle bone fragments have been unearthed, the vast majority from the ruins of the Shang capital at Yingchu near Anyang. They contain over 130,000 inscriptions covering an astonishing range of topics. Some record solar eclipses and the appearances of comets, making them among the earliest astronomical observations in human history. Others document military campaigns, royal hunts, harvests, sacrificial rituals, births, illnesses, and deaths within the royal family. Canadian missionary James Mellon Menzies became the first person to scientifically excavate, study, and decipher these bones, publishing his initial findings in 1917 and eventually amassing a personal collection of over 35,000 pieces, the largest private collection in the world. He insisted that his collection remain in China, even as colleagues worried about its safety during the Japanese invasion of 1937. The oracle bones did more than reveal an ancient method of divination. They proved the existence of the Shang dynasty itself, which historians had long doubted was real. The names of the Shang kings inscribed on the bones matched the dynastic lists recorded centuries later by the great historian Sima Qian in his Records of the Grand Historian. The bones confirmed that a sophisticated, literate civilization had existed in northern China over 3,000 years ago, and that, at its very heart, in the throne room of its most powerful ruler, the paramount concern was reading the future in the cracks of burned bone. The Shang kings believed that their ancestors, once dead, acquired foreknowledge of events that had not yet occurred. Success in war, the bounty of the harvest, the well-being of the royal family, all depended on whether the spirits of the departed looked favourably upon the living. Divination by oracle bone was not simply fortune-telling. It was a form of communication with the dead, a negotiation across the boundary between the visible world and the invisible one. And the symbols that appeared in the cracks were not random. They were messages, authored by the ancestors themselves, written in a language of fracture and fire that only the initiated could understand. Halfway around the world, in the river valleys of Mesopotamia, the land between the Tigris and the Euphrates, in what is now modern Iraq, another civilization was developing its own elaborate system for reading the future. The Babylonians, the Assyrians, and the peoples who preceded them believed that the gods communicated constantly with humanity through signs embedded in the natural world. Every natural phenomenon was potentially a message: the movement of the planets, the shape of a cloud, the direction of the wind, the pattern of oil dropped on water, and, above all, the appearance of the internal organs of sacrificed animals. The most important of these practices was hepatoscopy, the reading of a sheep's liver. Mesopotamian diviners known as Baru priests would sacrifice a sheep before any major decision and carefully examine the liver for irregularities. Every lobe, every groove, every discoloration carried meaning. A healthy, symmetrical liver was a sign of divine favor. A malformed or unusually colored liver was a warning. The Baru priests trained for years to master this art, studying clay models of livers that had been annotated with the meanings of various features. The most famous of these teaching tools is the liver of Piacenza, an Etruscan bronze artifact dating to about 400 BCE, discovered in northern Italy in 1877. Divided into sections corresponding to different deities, it served as a reference guide for trainee diviners who needed to know which part of the liver corresponded to which divine message. The Babylonians documented their divinatory knowledge with extraordinary thoroughness. The Enuma Anu Enlil, a collection of clay tablets from the 2nd millennium BCE, catalogued thousands of omens drawn from celestial observations: the movements of the moon and planets, eclipses, halos around the sun, the color of the sky at dawn. These were not idle superstitions. They were state instruments. The kings of Babylon and Assyria employed teams of professional diviners whose job was to monitor the signs and advise the court accordingly. Wrong predictions carried severe consequences. The Code of Hammurabi, one of the earliest legal codes in human history, reflected the societal importance of accurate divination. A diviner who provided false interpretations could face punishment. From these Mesopotamian roots grew a tradition that would spread across the ancient world, influencing civilizations from Egypt to Rome. Physiognomic divination, reading the future in the features of the human body, was documented in Mesopotamia as early as 2000 BCE. Special diviners would study a person's face, hands, and body, compiling their observations into texts that were passed down through generations. Some Mesopotamian priests even practiced a form of necromancy, summoning the spirits of the dead to inquire about future events. A necromancer was known as a seitemi, and surviving inscriptions record that these practitioners would raise spirits that appeared, it was said, like wind, to answer questions about what was to come. But nowhere in the ancient world was the art of prophecy more celebrated, more feared, or more consequential than in Greece, and no prophetic institution was more powerful than the Oracle of Delphi. Delphi sits on the southwestern slope of Mount Parnassus, above the Corinthian Gulf, in a landscape of staggering natural beauty. Steep cliffs, deep gorges, and olive groves stretching down to a glittering sea. The ancient Greeks believed that Delphi was the very center of the earth. According to myth, Zeus had released two eagles from opposite ends of the world, and they met at Delphi. A stone called the omphalos, the Greek word for navel, was placed there to mark the spot. Delphi was, quite literally, the navel of the world. The oracle that resided there was called the Pythia, a title given to the high priestess of the Temple of Apollo. She was chosen from among the women of Delphi. Originally a young virgin, but after one early priestess was abducted and assaulted, the rule was changed to require women over the age of 50. Upon assuming her role, the Pythia renounced her family, her marriage, and her individual identity. She belonged to the god. The Pythia's method of prophecy was unlike anything else in the ancient world. Before a consultation, she would bathe in the sacred Castalian spring, then drink from another spring called Cassotis. She would descend into a chamber below the temple called the Aditon, a word that literally means not to be entered, and there she would mount a golden tripod placed over a fissure in the rock. Chewing laurel leaves, the sacred plant of Apollo, she would inhale vapors rising from the earth below. Modern geological studies have confirmed that the temple sits directly above fault lines that likely released hydrocarbon gases, possibly ethylene or a mixture of carbon dioxide and methane, capable of inducing altered states of consciousness. Once she entered her trance, the Pythia would speak. According to the earliest accounts, such as those of the historian Herodotus writing in the 5th century BCE, she spoke in intelligible verse, dactylic hexameter, the meter of Homer's epics. Later accounts suggest that her utterances were sometimes unintelligible, interpreted and versified by the priests who attended her, but whether her words were clear or cryptic, they carried the weight of divine authority. No major decision in the Greek world, no expedition, no colony, no alliance, no war, was undertaken without consulting the oracle at Delphi. The Roman orator Cicero himself noted that virtually no affair of any distinguished individual went forward without the oracle's blessing. The Pythia operated continuously from at least the 8th century BCE until the late 4th century CE, a span of over 1,000 years. During that time, between 535 and 615 oracular statements are known to have survived in classical literature, and over half of them are considered historically accurate in their outcomes. But the accuracy was often a matter of perspective, because the Pythia's prophecies were legendary for their ambiguity. They were masterworks of double meaning, pronouncements that could be read in 2 or more ways, ensuring that the oracle would appear correct regardless of what happened. And this ambiguity produced some of the most dramatic stories in all of ancient history. The most famous of these stories involves Croesus, the king of Lydia, who reigned from about 585 to 546 BCE. Lydia occupied much of western Anatolia, the land we know today as Turkey, and Croesus was staggeringly wealthy. The phrase "rich as Croesus" entered common speech in the ancient world and has endured for over 2,500 years. His wealth came from the gold-bearing sands of the river Pactolus and from tribute extracted from the Greek cities along the Anatolian coast. During the reign of his father, Aliatis, the Lydians had become the first people in the world to mint coins, and Croesus himself continued to pour gold into Delphi, maintaining a relationship of generous patronage that stretched back several generations. But Croesus had a problem. To the east, the Persian Empire, under Cyrus the Great, was expanding with alarming speed. In 550 BCE, Cyrus had overthrown Astyages, the king of the Medes, and Astyages happened to be Croesus's own brother-in-law. The Persians were growing stronger by the year, and Croesus knew that eventually their ambitions would bring them to his borders. He had to decide, should he strike first, before Cyrus grew too powerful to stop, or should he wait and hope that the Persians would turn their attention elsewhere? Before making this decision, Croesus devised a test. He sent messengers to the most famous oracles in the known world, Delphi, Dodona, the oracle of Amphiaraus, and several others, with instructions to ask each oracle, on the 100th day after their departure from the Lydian capital of Sardis, what Croesus was doing at that precise moment. To make the test as difficult as possible, Croesus had deliberately chosen an absurd and unpredictable activity. He was boiling a tortoise and a lamb together in a bronze cauldron with a bronze lid. When the messengers returned, only the oracle of Delphi had given the correct answer. The Pythia's response, as recorded by Herodotus, was delivered in verse. She declared that she could count the grains of sand and measure the sea, that she understood the mute and heard the voiceless, and that she smelled a hard-shelled tortoise being cooked with lamb's flesh in a bronze pot, with bronze beneath and bronze above. Croesus was astounded. The oracle had described his bizarre activity with perfect precision. From that moment, he placed absolute faith in the Pythia, and so he asked his real question. The Pythia's answer became the most famous prophecy in the history of the ancient world. If Croesus crossed the Halys River and attacked Persia, he would destroy a great empire. Croesus heard what he wanted to hear. He interpreted the prophecy as a guarantee of victory. He assembled his armies, forged alliances with Sparta, Egypt, and Babylon, and crossed the Halys River into Persian territory. He engaged Cyrus's forces at Pteria, but the battle was inconclusive. Croesus burned Pteria to deny it to the enemy and retreated to Sardis, planning to regroup and resume the campaign in spring with reinforcements from his allies. But Cyrus did not wait for spring. He pursued Croesus immediately, catching the Lydian king off guard. At the Battle of Thymbra, the Persians routed the Lydian army. Cyrus then besieged Sardis itself, and after 14 days, the city fell. Croesus's wife took her own life. Croesus was dragged in chains before Cyrus, who ordered a great pyre built, and Croesus placed upon it, along with 14 noble Lydian youths. As the flames began to lick toward him, Croesus called out 3 times, "O Solon! Solon! Solon!" remembering the words of the Athenian sage Solon, who had once visited his court and warned him that no man could be called happy until after his death. Cyrus, intrigued, asked what Croesus meant. When the story of Solon was explained to him, Cyrus, realizing that he too was a mortal king subject to the whims of fortune, ordered the fire extinguished. According to Herodotus, a sudden rainstorm broke out and doused the flames, as if Apollo himself had intervened to save his faithful worshipper. But the prophecy had been fulfilled. Croesus had crossed the river, and a great empire had indeed been destroyed, his own. When the Lydians later sent to Delphi in chains and bitterness, demanding to know if the god was ashamed of having encouraged their king to make war, the Pythia's response was unyielding. She pointed out that the oracle had said a great empire would fall. It never specified which one. If Croesus had been wise, she said, he would have sent back to ask. The fault was not the gods. It was the king's for hearing only what he wished to hear. The story of Croesus echoes across the centuries as a warning about the nature of prophecy. The symbols that predict the future do not lie, but they can be misread by those whose desires cloud their judgment. This same lesson would be taught again and again to those who consulted the Pythia. In 480 BCE, the Persian king Xerxes, son of Darius the Great, assembled the largest invasion force the ancient world had ever seen and marched on Greece. The Athenians, terrified, sent envoys to Delphi. The first prophecy they received was so alarming that the envoys nearly fled without asking a second question. The Pythia told them to abandon Athens, for the city would be consumed by fire and war. Everything would be lost. But the Athenians demanded a second consultation. This time, the Pythia offered a cryptic glimmer of hope. Zeus would grant Athena a wall of wood, and this wall alone would remain unbreached. The Athenians debated furiously over what this meant. Some interpreted it literally, believing the oracle referred to a wooden palisade that had once surrounded the Acropolis. They argued that the citizens should barricade themselves on the sacred hill and await the Persians there. But a brilliant and persuasive politician named Themistocles offered a different reading. The wooden wall, he argued, was the Athenian navy, the wooden-hulled triremes that Athens had been building in recent years. The oracle was telling them to abandon the city entirely, evacuate the population to nearby islands, and stake everything on a naval battle. Themistocles prevailed. Athens was evacuated. When Xerxes arrived, he found the city empty and burned it to the ground, fulfilling the first prophecy. But the second prophecy was fulfilled as well. At the Battle of Salamis, in the narrow straits between the island of Salamis and the Greek mainland, the Athenian-led fleet destroyed the Persian navy. The wooden wall had saved Greece. Before that same invasion, the Spartans had also consulted Delphi, and the prophecy they received was even more chilling. The Pythia declared that either Sparta itself would be destroyed, or a king from the line of Heracles must die. There was no third option. King Leonidas, who traced his lineage to the mythic hero, understood immediately what the prophecy required of him. He selected exactly 300 Spartan warriors, each one a man who had living sons to carry on his bloodline, and marched them to the narrow coastal pass at Thermopylae. For 3 days in August of 480 BCE, Leonidas and his 300 held the pass against the entire Persian army. When a Greek traitor named Ephialtes revealed a mountain path that allowed the Persians to outflank the position, Leonidas dismissed most of his Greek allies but refused to retreat himself. The Spartans fought until every last one of them was dead, including their king. The prophecy had been fulfilled to the letter. Sparta survived, but a king of the house of Heracles perished. Far from Greece in the expanding world of Rome, the symbols of the future took different forms but served the same purpose. The Romans were, if anything, even more obsessed with divination than the Greeks. They embedded it into the very structure of their government and military operations. No army marched, no battle was joined, and no important public business was conducted without first consulting the signs. The most famous Roman method of military divination involved the sacred chickens. Copes of specially consecrated poultry were carried with every Roman army and fleet, tended by an official called a Pullarius. Before a battle, the Pullarius would scatter grain on the ground and release the chickens. If the birds rushed eagerly from their cages and devoured the grain, especially if bits of food fell from their beaks onto the ground, a sign called the Tripudium Solistimum, the omens were considered excellent. The gods approved. The attack should proceed. But if the chickens refused to eat or hesitated to leave their cages, the message was equally clear. The gods were displeased, and the battle should be postponed or abandoned. In 249 BCE, during the First Punic War between Rome and Carthage, a Roman consul named Publius Claudius Pulcher decided to test these beliefs and paid a terrible price. Pulcher commanded the Roman fleet that was blockading the Carthaginian stronghold of Lilybaeum on the western coast of Sicily. Eager to strike a decisive blow, he planned a surprise nighttime attack on the Carthaginian fleet anchored in the nearby harbour of Drepana. On the morning of the attack, as the Roman ships were approaching Drepana under cover of darkness, the Pullarius performed the ritual of the sacred chickens. The birds refused to eat. The omen was disastrous. Any other Roman commander would have called off the attack immediately. But Pulcher was not any other commander. He was arrogant, impatient, and contemptuous of what he considered superstitious nonsense. In a moment of sacrilegious fury that would echo through Roman history for centuries, he seized the chickens and hurled them overboard into the sea. His words, recorded by multiple ancient sources including Cicero, Valerius Maximus, and Suetonius, became one of the most infamous utterances in Roman military history. "Since they do not wish to eat, let them drink. The sacred chickens drowned." The attack proceeded, and it was a catastrophe. The Carthaginian commander Adherbal was not caught by surprise. His lookout spotted the Roman fleet, and he led his ships out of the harbour before they could be trapped. The Roman ships, spread out in a long disorganized line after their nighttime approach, crewed by 10,000 recently recruited and poorly trained oarsmen, found themselves pinned against the rocky Sicilian coastline with no room to manoeuvre. The Carthaginians, with their experienced crews and superior seamanship, attacked from the open sea. By the end of the day, Pulcher had lost 93 of his 123 ships. Over 20,000 Roman sailors and soldiers were dead. It was the worst naval defeat Rome suffered in the entire First Punic War, and one of the most lopsided naval disasters in all of ancient history. The Carthaginians did not lose a single vessel. Pulcher survived the battle, but his career did not. He was recalled to Rome and charged with treason. He was convicted of the lesser charge of sacrilege, specifically for the incident with the sacred chickens, and narrowly escaped a death sentence. He was heavily fined and exiled. His sister Claudia later became infamous in her own right when, stuck in a crowd-blocked Roman street, she was overheard wishing that her brother would lose another battle so there would be fewer commoners clogging the roads. The message was clear to every Roman citizen. The signs exist for a reason. The gods speak through symbols. Those who refuse to listen are destroyed. The Romans had another class of diviner, far more sophisticated than the keeper of the sacred chickens. The haruspex was a priest trained in the ancient Etruscan art of reading the entrails of sacrificed animals, particularly the liver. The Etruscans, who had dominated central Italy before the rise of Rome and whose culture profoundly influenced Roman civilization, had elevated entrail reading to a complex science. A haruspex would sacrifice a sheep, open its body and methodically examine the liver, lungs, heart, kidneys and intestines. Each organ was assessed for its colour, texture, shape and overall condition. A healthy, smooth, glistening liver was a sign of divine approval. A liver that was pale, shrunken, rough, or, worst of all, missing its distinctive central lobe, known as the head of the liver or caput ioceneris, was an omen of devastating proportions. Roman generals took these readings with deadly seriousness. A favourable reading from a haruspex could inspire an army to charge into battle with the confidence that the gods marched beside them. An unfavourable reading could delay a campaign for days or weeks as the commander waited for better signs. The Romans also practiced augury, the reading of the sky for divine messages. Official priests called augurs would climb to elevated positions and scan the heavens, interpreting the flight patterns of birds, the direction and intensity of lightning, the shapes of clouds, and the quality of thunder. Thunder on the left was considered favourable. Thunder on the right was a warning. The day of the week on which thunder occurred carried its own set of meanings. Thunder on a Friday, for example, was interpreted as a portent of the death of statesmen or generals. Centuries later, as the ancient world gave way to the medieval, the tradition of reading symbols to predict the future did not die. It transformed. And no figure in the history of prophecy illustrates this transformation more vividly than Michel de Nostradame, known to the world as Nostradamus. Born in December 1503 in the town of Saint-Rémy-de-Provence in southern France, Nostradamus came from a family of Jewish descent that had converted to Catholicism one generation before his birth. Both of his grandfathers had served as physicians to the court of King René of Provence. The young Nostradamus studied medicine at the University of Montpellier and spent years travelling through France and Italy, treating victims of the plague. He was, by all accounts, a skilled and compassionate doctor. But it was not medicine that would make his name immortal. In the 1550s, Nostradamus began publishing annual almanacs containing predictions for the coming year. These were enormously popular, and their success encouraged him to attempt something far more ambitious, a comprehensive collection of long-term prophecies extending far into the future. The result was Les Prophéties, The Prophecies, first published in 1555. The book contained hundreds of quatrains, 4-line poems written in a deliberately obscure style that mixed Middle French with Latin, Greek, and Occitan, creating verses that were almost impenetrably cryptic. Nostradamus claimed that his prophecies were based on the movements of the planets and stars in relation to the Earth, combined with knowledge drawn from ancient texts and his own intuitive gifts. In his preface, he stated that his predictions extended from his own time to the year 3797, over 2,000 years into the future. The ambiguity of his quatrains was deliberate and strategic. Nostradamus lived in an age when the Catholic Inquisition was active and the accusation of heresy or witchcraft could be fatal. By shrouding his predictions in multiple layers of linguistic obscurity, he made it impossible for anyone to accuse him of making specific, testable claims about the future. At the same time, this very vagueness is what has allowed generations of interpreters to find in his verses apparent predictions of events that Nostradamus could never have imagined. One of his most famous admirers was Catherine de' Medici, the wife of King Henry II of France. After reading Nostradamus's almanac for 1555, which contained veiled hints of threats to the royal family, Catherine summoned him to Paris to explain himself and to draw up horoscopes for her children. Nostradamus, who feared he might be beheaded, instead found himself elevated to a position of extraordinary influence. By the time of his death in 1566, Catherine had made him counsellor and physician-in-ordinary to her son, the young King Charles IX. Among the many events that Nostradamus's followers have retrospectively linked to his quatrains, several stand out for the apparent closeness of the match. One of the most widely cited concerns, the Great Fire of London, which erupted in September 1666 in the bakery of Thomas Fariner, on Pudding Lane and consumed much of the city over 4 days and nights, destroying approximately 13,000 homes. Nostradamus's quatrain, written over a century before the fire, makes reference to a calamity involving London, blood, and the number 66, though the precise connection depends heavily on how one translates and interprets the original Middle French text. Similarly, supporters have connected his verses to the French Revolution, which began in 1789 with the storming of the Bastille and led to the overthrow of the monarchy and the execution of King Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette. The quatrains in question describe a time of upheaval in which enslaved people rise up, princes and lords are imprisoned, and the existing order collapses. Whether these verses describe the French Revolution specifically, or any of 100 other popular uprisings that have occurred throughout history, remains a matter of passionate debate. Perhaps the most striking and most contested of Nostradamus's apparent predictions involves the rise of Adolf Hitler. Several quatrains contain the word Hister, which supporters have interpreted as a near anagram of Hitler. However, scholars have pointed out that Hister, or Ister, is in fact an ancient Latin name for the Danube River, which runs through Central Europe, a geographic reference rather than a personal one. The coincidence that Hitler was born near the Danube has added fuel to the speculation, but most academic scholars regard the connection as a product of wishful interpretation, rather than genuine prophecy. This, in fact, is the central paradox of Nostradamus's legacy. His quatrains are so vague, so multi-layered in their linguistic complexity, and so resistant to definitive translation that they can be made to fit almost any major historical event after the fact. Each generation discovers in his verses apparent predictions of whatever catastrophe has most recently befallen the world. The persistence of this pattern, what scholars have called a movable feast of interpretation, suggests that the power of Nostradamus's prophecies lies not in their accuracy, but in their ambiguity, not in what they reveal, but in what they allow us to project onto them. And yet Nostradamus was not entirely without genuine prescience. He correctly predicted the date and circumstances of his own death. On the evening of July 1st, 1566, he reportedly told his secretary, John de Chavigny, that he would not be found alive at sunrise. The next morning, he was discovered dead on the floor of his study beside his bed and a bench, and according to a widely circulated legend, When his grave was eventually opened years later, his body was found wearing a brass plaque on which was inscribed the exact date that the grave would be disturbed. What connects all of these stories? The oracle bones of the Shang dynasty, the liver-reading priests of Babylon, the Pythia at Delphi, the sacred chickens of Rome, the cryptic quatrains of Nostradamus, is something deeper than superstition or credulity. It is the fundamental human need to impose meaning on uncertainty. The future, by definition, does not yet exist. It is the realm of pure possibility, of infinite branching paths, and its unknowability is one of the most profound sources of anxiety in human experience. We cannot know what will happen tomorrow, or next year, or in the next moment, and this not knowing is, for most people in most times and places, almost unbearable. The ancient symbols that were used to predict the future, cracks in bone, patterns in entrails, vapours from the earth, stars in the sky, words in verse, were all, in their different ways, technologies for managing this anxiety. They provided a framework within which uncertainty could be contained, interpreted, and made actionable. A king who consulted the oracle bones before launching a military campaign was not simply engaging in magical thinking. He was performing a ritual that organized his decision-making process, consulted a recognized authority, built consensus within his court, and provided a narrative justification for whatever action was taken. If the campaign succeeded, the oracle had blessed it. If it failed, the oracle had warned against it, or had been misread. Either way, the system preserved its own legitimacy. The oracle at Delphi functioned in much the same way. The Pythia's prophecies were not straightforward predictions of what would happen. They were interpretive challenges, enigmas that required the consultant to think deeply about the possible consequences of his actions. When the oracle told Croesus that he would destroy a great empire, it was not lying. It was telling the truth in a way that demanded wisdom to understand. The prophecy functioned as a mirror, reflecting back the consultant's own assumptions and forcing him to confront the limits of his knowledge. Croesus failed because he was unable to imagine that the empire destroyed might be his own. The oracle did not betray him. He betrayed himself. Even the sacred chickens of Rome, seemingly the most absurd of all ancient divination methods, served a practical function. In a military context where tens of thousands of lives hung on a single decision, the chickens provided a mechanism for delayed or cautious action. If the omens were bad, a commander had a socially acceptable reason to postpone a battle, even if his real reason was doubt about his own tactical position or the readiness of his troops. The chickens gave institutional legitimacy to what might otherwise be seen as cowardice or indecision. Pulcher's fatal error at Drepana was not simply that he ignored a superstition. It was that he removed in a single act of contempt the check that Roman religious tradition had placed on reckless military command. Without the chickens, without the ritual framework that allowed for a divine veto on human folly, there was nothing to stop him from making the worst decision of his life. The tradition of reading ancient symbols to predict the future did not end with the fall of Rome or the death of Nostradamus. It continued to evolve, branching into new forms and adapting to new cultures. In medieval Europe, the practice of scrying, gazing into reflective surfaces such as crystal balls, mirrors, or pools of water to perceive future events, became widespread. Tarot cards, whose origins are debated but which became popular tools of divination during the Renaissance, provided another set of symbols through which the future could be interrogated. Runes, the ancient alphabetic symbols used by Germanic and Norse peoples, were cast like dice and read for their prophetic significance. In China, the I Ching, the Book of Changes, gradually replaced oracle bones as the primary method of divination, attributed to the legendary sage Fu Xi and compiled around 1000 BCE. The I Ching used a system of 64 hexagrams, each composed of 6 lines that could be either solid or broken, to represent every possible state of existence and transformation. Consultants would generate hexagrams by manipulating yarrow stalks or tossing coins, then look up their meaning in the text. The I Ching survived the Great Burning of books ordered by Emperor Qin Shi Huang in 212 BCE, one of the few ancient Chinese texts to do so, and it remains in use today, over 3,000 years after it was first composed. It is regarded by many not merely as a fortune-telling manual, but as a philosophical work of extraordinary depth, a living stream of human wisdom that continues to speak to those who consult it. In India, the practice of Jyotish, Vedic astrology, developed as a sophisticated system for reading the future in the positions of celestial bodies at the moment of a person's birth. Rooted in the Vedas, the most ancient sacred texts of Hinduism, Jyotish remains widely practiced today across South Asia and among Hindu communities worldwide. Palmistry, too, has deep roots in Indian culture, where the lines and shapes of the hand were believed to reflect not only a person's character, but their destiny. This practice spread from India to the Middle East and Europe, where it became one of the most enduring and popular forms of personal divination. In West Africa, divination systems of extraordinary complexity developed among peoples such as the Yoruba, whose Ifa oracle uses a vast corpus of memorized verses, and a system of binary symbols generated by casting palm nuts, or a divining chain. Among the Serer people of Senegal, only those initiated as saltigués, hereditary high priests and priestesses, were permitted to divine the future, combining their roles as spiritual leaders with those of healers and rainmakers. In Cameroon, the Mambila people developed a unique form of divination using spiders. Questions were posed by placing marked cards near the entrance to a spider's burrow, and the spider's rearrangement of the cards was interpreted as an answer from the spirit world. Each of these traditions, scattered across the globe and spanning thousands of years, shares a common architecture. There is a question born of uncertainty. There is a medium, bone, liver, vapor, stars, cards, shells, cracks, lines on a palm, through which the invisible forces that govern the future can be made visible. There is an interpreter, a priest, a priestess, an oracle, a seer, a diviner, who possesses the specialized knowledge required to read the symbols correctly. And there is a moment of revelation when the answer emerges from the chaos of possibility and becomes, however briefly, a fixed point around which decisions can be organized and actions taken. What modern observers often fail to appreciate is how seriously these systems were taken by the people who used them. The oracle at Delphi was not a carnival sideshow. It was the most respected religious institution in the classical world, consulted by heads of state and military commanders on matters of life and death. The oracle bones of the Shang dynasty were not curiosities. They were the official records of a divinely sanctioned government, archived with the same care that a modern nation devotes to its diplomatic correspondence. The haruspex who read the sheep's liver before a Roman battle was not performing a quaint folk custom. He was exercising a function as critical to the Roman military machine as the engineer who built the siege works, or the quartermaster who supplied the grain. These were not people who lacked intelligence or sophistication. The civilizations that produced oracle bones, hepatoscopy, the Delphic oracle, and augury were among the most advanced societies of their respective eras. They built cities, wrote literature, waged wars, developed mathematics, observed the stars, and governed vast populations. They were capable of extraordinary rational thought, and yet they also believed, with conviction that shaped the course of history, that the future could be read in the cracks of a heated bone or the loops of a sheep's intestine. Perhaps the most honest assessment is that they were grappling with the same mystery that still confronts us today. We have replaced the oracle with the algorithm, the augur with the analyst, the sacred chicken with the stock ticker. We consult data instead of entrails, and we dress our predictions in the language of probability rather than prophecy. But the underlying impulse is the same. We want to know what is coming. We want to be prepared. We want to believe that the future is not entirely random, that there are patterns in the chaos, signals in the noise, symbols that can be read if only we know how to look. The ancient symbols that predicted the future may or may not have worked. The cracks in the oracle bones may have been meaningless fractures in heated material. The Pythia's vapors may have produced nothing more than hallucinations. The sacred chickens may have refused to eat simply because they were seasick. But the human need that created these systems, the hunger for foreknowledge, the terror of the unknown, the desperate hope that someone, somewhere, can see what is coming and tell us how to survive it. That need is as old as consciousness itself. It is woven into the fabric of what it means to be human, and as long as the future remains unknown, we will never stop looking for the signs. The last prophecy of the Delphic oracle, according to the early Christian historian Philostorgius, was delivered to an envoy of the Roman Emperor Julian, who had sought to restore the old pagan religions, in a world that had turned decisively toward Christianity. The Pythia's final words, whether real or legendary, were a fitting epitaph for the entire tradition of ancient prophecy. She declared that the richly adorned hall had fallen to the ground, that Apollo no longer had a home, nor the prophetic laurel, nor the speaking spring. The water had dried up, and the voice was silent. But the silence was not permanent. The symbols changed. The methods evolved. The questions remained. And somewhere, in every age and every culture, someone is still looking at the cracks, the cards, the stars, the lines on a hand, searching for the message hidden in the pattern, the future written in the ancient symbols, the answer that was always there, waiting to be found.